So hi everybody, this is Oasis Digital. We're having our monthly Angular lunch. And for this month, we're just going to have a kind of a conversation, hopefully not terribly long, about things we've been doing to get ready for Angular 2.0. We think Angular 2 is probably going to ship within the next couple of major Angular conferences. I think we've been talking about, we don't really know how many it will be, but we can't imagine they're going to go too many major conferences before they ship it. So we feel like now is the time to get ready for anybody who's not getting ready yet. So you want to say hello and
Hello,
talk a little bit?
I'm Paul Spears. Been kind of following along online, more so along the path of ES6, TypeScript, component router, the things that are ready. Been trying to look at things from that perspective rather than, oh, what's 2.0 got in the box. So that's kind of what I'm going to mostly have a reference to.
So what about that component router? Can we look at that yet, or is that still in development?
Yeah, it's still technically in development. It's not in the 1.0. It's not been backported to the 1.x path yet. But yeah, you can go check it out and start to use it, start building apps with it. They got some documentations.
So it's on this Angular.io you have up?
Let's see, it's not going to be here. This is for Angular 2. This is kind of their site that they're going to mostly push all of the.
So you got to go to
Angular
GitHub to get it or something? Or?
Yeah, if you're going to get it, you got to go to GitHub. If you just type component router in your search, you're going to find it a lot easier.
Oh wow, great.
Actually, it helps if you also say Angular.
So it's not released yet, but if you go Googling for it, you can find your way. There you go, Angular router right there.
Where did we go?
Yeah, it's that very first one.
Router. Yep, that's the one.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is the new router for 1.4. It didn't actually make it into 1.4, unfortunately, but it's looking like it's getting closer.
Okay. So you tried it yet?
Yeah, I tried it a little bit. Kind of ran into some issues where it just wasn't quite baked all the way yet. There's still a couple of key features that we expected that we don't have yet. But I'm liking the pattern that it's bringing to routing in Angular. I just kind of holding off a little bit longer for it to finish.
I think you had mentioned, I think maybe in one of these previous meetings, that there were a few features from the old router that hadn't made it in the new router yet that you were eager to see.
Yeah, the biggest issue that people are looking for is something like a resolve mechanism, delaying the navigation away from one route to another until they can have some data ready. And there was various lifecycle hooks that you could get placed to kind of hack that functionality back in. And that wasn't quite really doing it for a lot of people, though. They still really want a more formal mechanism for that as far as the community feedback goes. And then there was things like, though not in the base router itself, but things that are already in things like UI router, such as the nested routes, sibling routes, those kinds of things that they've got sibling routing working, but nested routing isn't. It is definitely going to happen, though. They thought they had it working there for a while. It had broken along the way in one of their releases. So it's that's something I expect to see pretty soon.
So is the goal for this router to actually take over kind of the role of the early Angular router is kind of just like, here's a base thing that you can use if you don't need to do something complicated, and UI router exists for actual like usage of production? Is this going to kind of, is this actually trying to take over that UI router position then? And actually, this is the router for everybody?
It feels like it,
okay.
Because it is completely changing the approach. It has a completely different approach from either the old 1.0 router and the 2.0 router, or a UI router. It's got a brand new look and feel to it, and it's about saying, okay, I've got my application composed of various components, and here's how you get to them.
Okay.
So it's less of I've got this large, complicated, set of states in my application that I need to manage with, lacing together bits and pieces of a routing system. It's, here's the chunks of my application. Here's how you get to it.
Sure.
And my impression from what we've seen in documents that the team has floated and in conference talks is that they're hoping that, they're not trying to say there won't be any third-party routing.
Right.
But they're hoping that the base router will be extensible in such a way that people extend the base router for the next generation of third-party routing. Versus what we saw in the Angular 1 product, which is where everyone basically ignores the router that's in the box and uses UI router instead.
Okay, so even the third-party routers will probably follow the same kind of
paradigm
and the structure.
So we can't speak for those people. It looks like they're trying to make that possible.
That'd be awesome.
That would be a big improvement. So what else? So we talked about the router now. The other big news is TypeScript, which will become an extension of ES6. And although every time anyone asks, the core team vigorously says, you won't have to use it. You can write plain JavaScript if you want. The obvious writing on the wall is that, like the first class citizen, the way to really do Angular right in 2.0 is going to be with TypeScript on ES6. So John here has been working on moving a substantial code base from plain JavaScript 5 to TypeScript. How's it going?
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a steep hill to climb, but once I got up, over that first hump, it's not too bad. And I'm kind of hoping that, I know it's not going to be easy just taking the ES6 code and converting it to Angular 2, but I'm hoping that making that step from Angular 1 to ES6 to ES2, Angular 2, I'm thinking that's going to be a lot easier than if we were just to take our regular ES5 code and try and put it all in Angular 2.
So it's not quite a straight line, but you feel like we're taking a big step in the right direction.
Yeah. And I'm kind of like Paul, I've been looking at pieces of Angular 2, but I haven't been following it closely, so I can't say for certain which parts are going to be simple and which parts won't, but I really think it's a big step in the right direction towards making that conversion.
Yeah, I think when we talked about it the other day, we talked about really that there's really no reason not to start. Like, it's not going to hurt you, right? If you're working today in Angular and you think you're going to go to Angular 2.0, there's really no reason to not start with TypeScript today.
Well, yeah. I mean, I would say if you're working in Angular and you're thinking about doing anything, if you're working in JavaScript and you're thinking about working in JavaScript later,
you ought to be using ES6,
go to ES6
maybe you ought to
and
try
TypeScript.
TypeScript, right?
Yeah.
So just to give a crash, sorry, TypeScript, is TypeScript to ES6 what JavaScript is to ES5? Is it an implementation of ES6?
No. So ES6 is the next generation of JavaScript, and it adds numerous language constructs.
Okay.
TypeScript is older, actually. It's Microsoft's kind of branch
Like
of
the
JavaScript, which it used to add maybe 15% of the stuff from ES6, and then it added a type system.
Got it.
Well, there was this big, I guess, revelation. Was that
Yeah.
in February or no, March at the Angular conference?
That's the Angular
That the Google folks and the Microsoft folks had gotten together and hugged each other or something. And the next generation of Angular 2, will be built to use TypeScript, but it'll be the next version of TypeScript, which will be an extension of ES6 instead of an extension of JavaScript for ES5.
Got it.
And so I think they just shipped TypeScript 1.5, like what, 3 days ago? As we
Yeah.
record this?
It's in the last couple weeks.
Yeah, and it looks like it has about 80% of ES6 in it.
So browser compatibility, how's that going to work out with?
Well, so
TypeScript?
with all these things, you're using a compiler,
Okay, so
which is
pre-compiles back over.
emitting ES5
Got it.
to work with browsers. I mean, we all hope that someday that won't be necessary, but I think realistically at this point you should assume that going forward you're going to use the compiler stuff, because by the time browsers in wide release are implementing a large part of ES6, that wide release is the hard part, right? That's a process that takes years.
Yep.
So by the time ES6 is what's the baseline out there, you won't want to use it anymore. You want to use ES whatever. We've really enjoyed the mileage we've gotten out of using just the JavaScript that's in the box. We think that, especially for our classes, for teaching, it's really great if you can just use what's in the box. But where we're seeing the industry going, at least from where I'm sitting, I think you said the same thing. I think you're not interested in throwing away TypeScript anytime soon. It's just unrealistic to think that if you're doing significant development going forward, that you're not going to be using a compilation step to get from what the code you type to the JavaScript you deploy.
I think even if you do actually reach that point where we can start writing ES6 natively on our browsers, there's likely going to be something else that comes along that we're going to be targeting that we need to compile down to. So having that process and that mindset in place within your team and internally being able to wrap your head around that process, I think is a good practice to have in place anyway.
So what else is there for Angular 2? So there's the new router, there's TypeScript and ES6. How about the new template syntax? there was a huge explosion on the internet of opinion after the first draft of that template syntax came out. What have you been hearing since then?
I've not really heard all that much. I think most people are still of the opinion that you guys could have done a better job, but no one succeeds in providing one that actually solves all the problems that they tried to solve with it. Yeah, I know that there's been a ton of pushback on it, just kind of saying, I don't know, this is kind of ugly, it's kind of, polluting our templates a little bit with more stuff than we'd like. But then it kind of went quiet, and I don't know what's going on, really. I've not heard any news about it, or if they're working to continue to smooth over those edges, or if everyone's kind of accepted the fate of the new way of binding. I'm not really sure.
The most recent I saw was maybe a couple of months ago, and there is a revised version of the templates. And it looks like they had fixed the worst problems anyway that people had been panicking about anyway. Oh, is this
This is actually a really recent post.
Great. Yeah, I think,
Updated
yeah.
just a couple
Oh,
days ago.
fantastic, okay. I think I saw the earlier version of this. Yeah, absolutely. So there's the syntax with brackets and parentheses and so on. And it should greatly reduce the amount of specific syntax you need. So for example, you shouldn't need so you don't need like an ng source directive anymore, because there's already a way to bind to the source attribute just using a standard syntax.
Mhm.
So I know there's a lot of dispute, but I'm actually really looking forward to the new syntax. I think it's going to be a lot nicer to work with once we get used to it. I think it's gonna lower the difficulty of learning, because it's more consistent.
Yeah, and that's kind of feel I've got from it also, is that it may look ugly. I mean, this right here, like this kind of pattern in your HTML,
Yeah.
that's just weird looking.
Yep.
I mean, there's no way to look at that any other way than just like, that looks weird.
Yeah.
But I think once you start realizing like what all of those different combinations
Well,
get you,
scroll on down. I think there might be something less bad.
that was the syntax.
The bottom one is the
Angular
less bad.
provides the syntax.
Right. Well, the bottom one. See, the
Yeah.
bottom one is shorter anyway.
Yep.
But one thing that I really like about the new syntax, though, and this is a thing that we had a struggle in teaching, and that is under Angular 1.x, you have to consult the documentation for each directive to know whether the thing you type in it is the name of something on the scope,
Right.
or whether it's something where you need to type the squigglies if you want an expression.
Right.
And with the new syntax, once you learn the rule, that rule applies exactly uniformly to every Angular use. So I'm really looking forward to that. I think that'll take out a few of the speed bumps in getting people going.
Yeah. And that's true. That's really hard to get people past, is that the way the directive, which you didn't create, was written, determines how you have to pass that in. Whether or not it was binding to a string property or a scope property. You have no control over that whatsoever as a consumer of that directive.
You gotta
And
consult the
just simply have to
documentation,
know how to
right.
pass in.
Right.
It kind of broke that almost that kind of fantasy feel of it being like functions in your HTML,
Right.
because you had to go and figure out exactly what kind of string to munch together to get exactly what you wanted passed in. So
And then whether it would actually whether it would evaluate it or whether it
Right.
would just check it as it exists.
Absolutely. That was
That's annoying.
many times I said, well, let's go look at that. Let's go look at the source code to figure out what it does, and that's just not right. You want to be able to pass a parameter without doing that. So I want to go a little farther on the ES6 track by seeing if Jack over here has anything to say. Jack has been working with ES6 outside the scope of Angular 2, but instead over with Protractor, which is currently an Angular 1 tool, but as I understand, there's a Protractor version under development to work with Angular 2. But kind of totally separately from that, if ES6 is a better language, which we all seem to think it is, how's that going using ES6 for our end-to-end tests?
Well, the tests I've been writing really haven't been taking that much advantage of ES6.
I know the arrow syntax I've seen.
The arrow functions are, I think, the most major thing that I've been using, and so that's saves some characters and
Takes out some noise, visual noise.
so that is nice. So, and it definitely doesn't like add any extra baggage on top of anything. So it's like I barely notice that I'm actually in a new thing. It's in using ES6 over in that way, even since I'm not using any of the extra features right now.
So I've noticed it in the other direction. When I look at our newer test code, which is tightened up using the short, just the most basic feature of ES6, the tighter syntax for functions, then when I step into a file that's still the old way, it's sort of just starkly verbose and hard to look at.
I've been working continuously.
You've been looking
so
forward, right?
I haven't looked back yet. So.
Yeah, so I think this might be one of those things where when you look forward, you can kind of convince yourself, well, it's not that big of a hurry, but once you've stepped into the new tool, then you look back at your old code and you sort of wince.
Well, there have been a couple times where I start typing out the word function, and I'm just
Right.
like, wait a minute,
Wait,
I don't
right.
need to do that anymore.
Right.
I think there's going to be a little learning curve to reading the new code too.
Sure.
I mean, because of that, yeah, it was ugly before when you've got a function and then it passes a callback function, that gets a callback function, but then all of a sudden this is one line of code.
Yeah.
Like, okay,
There's
what
like
is all
four
this do?
functions.
Right.
Right.
Like reading Link for the first time.
Yeah, it's definitely, there's gonna be a learning curve.
Is there any kind of like JSCS kind of like a style guide, style checking tool that exists for ES6 yet? It's kind of the
So-
industry standard.
So ESLint
Okay,
has some ES6 features now.
sure.
I think that ES6 hasn't been around and in wide use enough for there to be as kind of as many agreed style lints. But yeah, definitely, whenever you add a bunch of powerful new features, there's just numerous opportunities to use them in confusing ways.
Right.
So far, we're taking the approach of kind of being kind of conservative in adopting the new features. We're not trying to adopt every ES6 feature at once. We're trying to pick the ones that seem like they're the smallest step
Right.
and try to get those fully absorbed into a code base and then start.
Take the big wins in the
Right.
short term. Yeah. that makes
Right.
sense.
It's like we're not using generators yet. Generators are really slick, and apparently they're really useful for some kinds of testing, and we're not using a single one from yet.
Sure. I think it's something that Mark Volkman, when he came into his ES6 talk, he talked about how they had used that approach at his company to kind of slowly introduce the features,
Yeah.
and we're taking a very similar approach.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, if anybody sees this on video, if you look in our YouTube channel and go back a few videos, it was Mark Volkman talking about ES6. You should be able to find that.
He's kind of gone whole hog now with ES6, it sounds like, and he's happy as can be with it, so.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's using Tracer as his back compiler, I think.
When I last spoke, he was using Tracer. That was some months ago. So until a few months ago, Tracer, that was the kind of the apex tool.
Sure.
There's been this very rapid shift. It seems like all the cool kids are switching to Babel
Okay.
very, very quickly. It seems so. Two of the other tools combined to form Babel,
Okay.
and they are now up there with Tracer in terms of implementing a high percentage of the spec. And
Sure.
TypeScript 1.5 is close behind. But I hear people saying things like Tracer is more of Google's experimental or exploratory tool for the future of JavaScript,
Got it.
and that Babel is the one that's being kind of getting more mass adoption as the tool to start using today. So we're using some of each. I think, Jack, you're using Babel?
Yeah.
And then you're using TypeScript?
Right.
And our hope is to kind of stick to the subset. Like there's kind of this visual Venn diagram in your mind. There's a large subset of ES6 that's supported by both of those. So our intention is to use things that are in that subset for a while and let the tool maturity catch up, let them all catch up with each other before we start going to the edges. They're very quiet.
I haven't had anything done yet.
So there's actually something that's also really interesting to me about TypeScript, and that was John was telling me about the process of implementing it, and we've got this process now where we're adding a type system to an existing language, and our application consists of a large block of code that we didn't write. Like all of our library
Right.
code we didn't write,
Right.
so it doesn't have the type system up to the point where we start to consume it.
Mhm.
And I had given that zero consideration whatsoever until I was talking about John about the implementation. Can you talk about TSD a little bit?
So there's this repository, or it's a tool called Definitely Typed, which has a repository that I guess they just
Bring
take,
that up,
anyone
maybe.
can contribute to. But it's very well maintained, and I would say, I think there are close to 1,000 JavaScript libraries that whoever has created type definitions for and submitted to this repository. You use this tool called TSD and say, I'm pulling in Angular in my project. I just do TSD install Angular, and now I have type definitions for everything in the Angular library. And so in addition to making sure I'm using typing correctly in my code, I can make sure that any Angular functions or modules I use, I'm also calling them correctly. Yeah, and again, it's something I didn't even think about until I tried to compile TypeScript, and they're like, hey, there's no type for Angular dot whatever.
Right.
I thought, oh man, I don't have to create all those,
Right.
do I?
Right.
So yeah, this is definitely a tool you want to use if you go to TypeScript.
So we had a wrinkle on that come up today, and we can't talk about these customer-specific stuff, but counting the number of package managers in our system. So it is pretty easy to have a production system where you're using like, apt or something on Linux to deploy it. And that's kind of down on this base level, but then up in the application, you're using maybe Maven or Gradle for dependency management, and you're using NPM to bring in server-side JavaScript, and then Bower to bring in client-side JavaScript, and now we're using TSD to bring in type definitions for either of those JavaScript. Which others am I missing? Because I know there's more. Oh, there's JSPM. And JSPM is coming up quickly because the current generation of package managers really aren't aware of ES6, and so they don't help you that much with ES6. JSPM kind of abstracts over those.
Browserify is kind of part of NPM.
Right, yeah. So it's the number of different places you can have dependencies coming from on a project can get pretty impressive. And I'd say it's going to get incrementally worse as JavaScript advances.
I also noticed today that this definitely type is actually linked to from the TypeScript website. So this is as official as it's going to get.
Yeah. There you go. Click on TypeScript there. I think it might be the, yeah. There's been the TypeScript. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. I think up under interact maybe.
And I don't know. Yeah, it's right there. By the way, anybody who hasn't tried TypeScript yet, you can hit play there. And you can actually type TypeScript right here in the browser, and it will compile for you in the browser, so you can sort of see what happens to the types. So there, it's a nice little tool when you're working with it. First learning. Obviously, it doesn't do much for a real application because you could depend on numerous files that aren't here. But I would definitely recommend this for anybody heading this way. I can talk a little bit about these type systems. I have heard from people that seem to know what they're talking about, but not yet personally verified, that Facebook's type system for JavaScript has some kind of type theory advantages. It does some extra stuff that TypeScript doesn't do. I don't remember what those are. But I think that unfortunately that kind of doesn't matter if you're in the Angular world, because since Microsoft and Google are working closely on TypeScript for Angular 2, like whatever those advantages are to Facebook's type system, we probably aren't going to get those for a while. We'll have to just live without them, whatever they are. So maybe if we don't learn what they are, we won't be as frustrated by not having them. Recommend not learning about any weaknesses in TypeScript. If you're stuck with it, someone else made the choice. So what else can we say about Angular 2? We've talked about ES6 and TypeScript. We've talked about the new template syntax.
Anyone know anything more about the Shadow DOM they can talk about? That's something I'm
Shadow
not interested
DOM.
in, but don't know anything about.
We need to have like a whole talk about that.
I mean, yeah, there was a good kind of crash course in it, and the time when you guys just came back from Angular on GCount. But that's the last I heard about it, really.
Yeah.
How about the schedule? Have we heard anything about when we're going to get Angular 2?
Not word.
They are intentionally avoiding that question.
So you were at an Angular conference just a couple months ago. And
Yeah,
I'm
and
sure,
they had-
sure it was asked. What did you hear
Oh, they had
in person?
Visco on a hangout
Oh.
and somebody, doing a Q&A, and of course, one of the first questions was, when is it coming out? And I think the question, or the answer was along the lines of, we're working on it.
I thought you were going to say his connection just dropped. Does he work for
Disappeared for a
Debian?
while.
Just- I couldn't hear your question. Could you?
So yeah, I know they're intentionally not even trying to hint at a release date, so people, and so we don't get to that date, and people say, well, you kind of hinted at it back here.
Yeah.
I haven't heard anything since then that's changed that.
So Bill, who's not with us today, I think he's teaching, he was at Angular U. And I had asked him if anybody announced a date, and he said no. And of course, if they had, we would have heard. It would have been filled the interwebs.
Yeah.
But my suspicion is sooner than we think. That we shouldn't. My suspicion is that if we look at the trajectory of when it'll be ready, and we use that to predict, that's too far in the future. I feel like that they may have to, curve a little scope like they did before on Angular 1.4 or something, because I feel like the JavaScript world is moving at supersonic speed. And
I feel like just by announcing the big changes in Angular 2, you kind of have to hurry up and release, because if you look on the internet at Angular forums, the question of is it worth my time to learn Angular 1 is popping up more and more.
Right.
And the answer, depending on who answers the question first, some people are coming in and saying no, go to this instead.
Right. I think our answer is yes, but learn things will help you move to 2.
And I think that's
not a very satisfying answer.
I think that's the correct answer, but the farther we get between announcement of 2.0, announcement of huge changes, and here they are, I think we're going to grow toward, no, this is actually ready to go. You should use that instead.
Yeah. Yeah, the last thing we want to hear is that you should just use React instead, right?
Yeah.
See, React is a great tool, but you don't want to have someone who's coming in toward Angular decide to move away from it because of a threatened future release. And I know that there's a long history in our industry. We might have been able to get Michael, who's standing across the room from us, to talk about that a little bit. There's a long history in our industry of companies completely torpedoing themselves by announcing version next of some key product, and then demand falls off for the old one before the new one comes out. And I guess it's not as dangerous on an open source thing you're just giving away, but to the extent you can have that happen by losing market share, it is a risk they faced. That's why I really suspect that we're going to see it ship sooner than we would estimate based on, you've been watching the flow of the work, and you might predict it be a while, and I predict it might be sooner than you would say it'll be ready.
Yeah, that's probably fair, just given their track record of, it's done enough, you can go ahead and start using it.
I think they have to be under tremendous pressure, I feel like, from people that are up the food chain, a few notches from any of us.
Well, especially when we consider how many people are just ignoring the fact that Google's saying it's not ready and they're just doing it anyway. Like they're getting a hold of the source, compiling it, and using it.
So I have a confession. Here at Oasis Digital, we actually have a small group doing exactly as you say, ignoring the fact that it's not ready and picking it up and starting to convert some small apps to it. So yeah, I feel like if you wait till something is done, that's too late. You have to use things before they're done if you want to stay on the leading edge.
Yeah, I think that's what's going to happen, is that it's going to be unofficially ready because everyone else says so, and then eventually ready because Google says so.
Right.
So in the vein of what you just talked about, how big of an application is a 1.4 application before you just don't bother switching it to 2, right? You just, this is too large. It's going to take too long to convert it over to 2 when it comes out. How complex does an application need to get before the payoff isn't worth it to switch it forward?
That's a good question.
I think it's hard to answer until we see what migration path they ship.
That's fair.
Yeah.
But
and how long you tend to maintain it. If it's an application that you plan to that your company relies on and expects you for a very long time,
right?
You're probably going to migrate it eventually, because sooner or later, there's a fixed timeline that they've given for when 1.x stops getting supported by Google.
They said they say at least 18 months or at least 2 years.
I thought they moved it to 3 years.
At least 3
Yeah,
years.
It was 2 at one point. Yeah, I think they might have moved it to 3. But and then after that, you've got probably there's going to be a community that supports it, but sooner or later that community is going to diminish because they'll have moved everything.
Sure.
They'll have either boxed it up and put it away, or they'll have moved it to something else. So it's there's a timeline there. If it's a long time, you're going to support it.
3 years is a long time in JavaScript world.
3 years is a super long time.
There's a new framework every 4 days.
Yeah. I think 4 got released while we were standing here.
So Matt, I happen to know, we don't name any names because we want to publish this video. You're responsible for or aware of some pretty substantial Angular 1.x apps. Do you have anything to add based on that experience, which is a separate pool of apps from the rest of our experience? in terms of what you're thinking about 2.0 or the transition or?
So yeah, so there's I can't speak for some of them. What's been kind of interesting to me right now is I have been building out a new Angular.1x app since they announced it, and since the question started becoming, well, is it even worth looking into this? And I actually made the claim, and now I apparently am making it on the internet, that the original timeline that they gave, that they would probably slip on, or that they would at least push back on how much time they would support, and that apparently they did. And so what I had said at the time was, I think it's worth adopting 1.x because it's the best option right now, and it'll be a long time before we have to migrate it if we want to.
Sure.
And by then we can consider what our options are at that point. And if you write this stuff right, it shouldn't be that much. It's changing boilerplate versus changing like architectural things. But we haven't, I suspect for us, one of the things that we're probably looking at is we're probably looking more at the how you run Angular 2 and ECMAScript 5, which I know is not a popular opinion amongst a lot of people. But I'm relying on the fact that there's probably going to be a large enough community that has large development shops that it's just going to be arduous to move everybody, that there are going to be tools that are going to get built around making this easy in what the, like what Romana already is. And then we can worry about migrating it as that time goes on. It's hard to get, especially teams that are full stack, it's hard to convince them like, okay, now this part of the stack, learn a whole nother language for it while you're dealing with all of the other things that are going on everywhere else in the stack. So
you're actually talking about possibly kind of the opposite order that we are here. We're talking about moving to ES6 and TypeScript ahead of Angular 2 to make the Angular 2 transition easier and faster for us.
Right.
You're talking about moving to Angular 2 prior to moving to those tools.
And seeing if the community builds out a tool set that'll make that. If I'm wrong on that, I mean, we've got a long runway either way.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's so that's where we're looking at it. And honestly, every so often for projects that I work on, I just kind of think about like maybe I could get a pull request in that nobody would notice that switches the pipeline to start doing TypeScript compilation, and it won't matter anyway because it's all a superset. So maybe it'll work just fine and nobody will notice, and I can just start adding things in. But I feel like that's not being a team player. I don't know.
That's actually what I advise students in our classes. They're talking about like, well, how do I get ready? And I say, well, whenever no one's looking, you put the TypeScript. And yeah, that actually would be the
You sneak in the building over a Christmas break,
Yep.
and you.
And then that, exactly for that reason, it's a superset, then, you start writing some code that's using the arrow function, and then someone finally goes, what's
What
that?
is this arrow?
And you say, oh, well, it's this brand new thing you can do, and then they all of a sudden love it before they even realize that they're fighting it. So.
Yeah. You find some just giant pull request that's really important for some other reason. And it's just a line in the pipeline. It's like,
I mean, just kind of echo your feelings. I feel like kind of getting everything in the same language is important, right? So like, if you can't write TypeScript in Node, I think that's going to be super impactful for some people, right?
Well, why
Just
can't
like,
you though?
Well, no, you can. That's
Yeah.
what I'm saying, right? Like, you need to be able to have that whole stack all be in the same language, and that's super important in some shops. So.
There's actually a really interesting thing that Node brings up. And we're like only this much of a Node shop, or a big Angular shop, a minor Node shop. With Node, you're usually the one deploying the execution environment. And that's great because you're not stuck with running your JavaScript on whatever the oldest browser any user has, right? You're say, I'm running this current thing. I can use whatever IO.js, it's merging back in, most current, can be compiled that morning and you're using it. That means that you actually can run ES6 natively instead of having to transpile.
That's fair.
And I discovered that TypeScript has a setting where you can tell TypeScript to only do the type system part, but to just pass through all the other features.
Oh, right.
So you can actually use TypeScript at a type system to ES6 and not use its ES6 to ES5 compilers. It's just a setting you pass. It says skip that, kind of do this part and skip all the rest of this part.
That's rad.
Yeah, so that's still a compilation step, but it's kind of a much smaller.
Right, yeah.
It's basically erasing all the checking all the type definitions and then erasing them and passing the code through. So it should be a kind of easier to adopt. It's less scary to adopt something that's only going to erase parts of the code after it checks them, whereas it's more scary to adopt something that's going to kind of wholesale transform the code as you run it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So are you using Node?
For some stuff. I mean, like everywhere else, everything's fully heterogeneous. But yeah, there's a fair amount of Node that we're using. For the back end, everything's mostly in Grails, but a lot of the tools along the way are using
Sure.
Node. So yeah, I mean, it's been really kind of nice to not have to remember how Java works when you're writing your applications. But yeah, I think that like one of the big things is when I switch over to ES6, and I haven't done it because I'm a bad person. But
That's not the point of all this.
yeah. No, it's not public shaming time. It's fine. But no, when I switch over, I definitely want to be doing ES6 in the back end as well, right? Because like that's the whole advantage of having them both in the same thing. Is you
And
don't
that's
have to worry
easy,
about
though.
it.
It's easy to switch on the back
Absolutely.
end.
Yeah. So it's gonna be nice. I mean, just change your Docker version and you're done.
Yeah, I think it's like you pass a command line option to Node, I think, and it enables
like I said, I haven't
it's
looked at it
really
yet,
easy.
but
It's really easy.
Yeah.
Well, how long are we gone here?
We're into
We should probably wrap up pretty soon. Does anybody have any other Angular 2 related topics to talk about before we call it good?
So I'm hoping to start migrating our small app to Angular 2 as soon as possible because we're going to start a new release and it's going to be a very large app. But one of my concerns is, so let's say Angular 2 is ready tomorrow. We're using like Angular UI and stuff like that. When are those libraries going to be ready? Or we're going to have to like rewrite everything?
That is an excellent question. So the question that was from someone maybe on camera but far away from the microphone was something along the lines of, I'm using a lot of add-on libraries for Angular, and how are those going to get transitioned to work with 2? And that, one thing we really struggle with is that we often find we need some third-party libraries to implement many parts of an application. Of course, you can always just write it all yourself, but that slows you down a lot, right? So we find ourselves needing a lot of them. And to put it kindly, many of them don't get that much attention from their developers over time, right? So it's a fairly common phenomenon to pick a category of tool and you kind of go shopping, right? Maybe you find a couple of commercial tools that are kind of related and 17 open source tools, and you look around and like the commercial one looks good, but then maybe you float adding commercial dependency and somebody objects. So maybe you look at the open source ones, you sort them out, and you don't find 19 of them that are like super up to date and fully robust and supported. You actually find you have to rule most of them out because they haven't had a commit in 3 years, right? They're just dead in the water. Then you find some that have a list of 97 open GitHub issues reaching back the last year, of which the most recent 5 are, is this project alive? So we see that. I'm sure you've seen that a few times. You're sort of lucky if you find one project when you go shopping for a certain kind of tool that's good enough. And we often find we have to accept one which is somewhat supported, right? Like one where, it has some issues that really ought to be fixed, and we can kind of work around them. So we're very concerned about the same thing. I kind of feel like the market for add-ons might end up treating Angular 2 more like a new framework than as a new version, because the add-on, like the add-on that does, what's a good example of an add-on?
UI Bootstrap.
Yeah, so UI Bootstrap, it may have no lines of code in common between UI Bootstrap for Angular 1.4 and UI Bootstrap for Angular 2.0. And so it's not even, like, I think it'd be too much to assume that even the same people or the same project will produce the 2.0 version. You might have to have some new competitors arrive. And so it might be a matter of even switching out a competing library for some of them. And if you have one, that's probably no big deal. If you have 19 of them in your program, which we sometimes do.
So I suspect that we're going to see with the 2.0 components the same thing we saw with Angular 1.x components. What they did was they took jQuery, but everyone used beforehand, and they put just enough Angular around it to make it an Angular component.
Right.
Later on, they got around to rewriting it natively. I'm guessing that's what we're going to see again.
Yeah.
They're going to take the 1.x components, whether it be the actual author of the original one, or we do it internally, or somebody else entirely, but they're going to take just enough of it, wrap just enough 2.0 around it, so we can use it natively as a 2.0, and then somewhere along the line, they're probably going to rewrite it. And that's what I suspect will happen.
So just to like talk about UI Bootstrap specifically, it's kind of depressing. I don't think their 1.3 release is even out yet. They're unofficially supporting 1.3, but it's not officially supported yet, despite like like their 1.4 release branch hasn't even been started yet.
That's the main one you use?
Yeah, that's what I'm worried about is UI Bootstrap.
Yeah.
We're not that big yet, so we don't, but we're using, particularly the modals, like everywhere. And I looked at it, like, how hard can it really be to write my own Google form? So I'm hoping it'll be okay.
I'd say probably like a quarter of Angular projects are using UI Bootstrap, or at least Angular UI,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
it's a massive percentage. And I mean, for the most part,
Like most of ours do.
Yeah.
Use it
people
some.
are running 1.4 and it kind of mostly works, but there are lots of little issues you're going to find when you're using
Right.
it. Even now,
Fortunately, though, like almost everyone has it, but they use like one component.
True.
So,
valid.
As long as that one works.
Yeah.
For the most part.
or we can make
Yeah.
that one work.
So in fact, I would say that since that's the one that you're concerned with, UI Bootstrap, that's one that probably, I think everybody here kind of nodded. That's probably the one that we're most likely to have a decent experience with, because it's something that everybody wants, and the likelihood that somebody will do the work is really high. It's if you depend on a dozen really niche, narrow components that hardly anybody uses, that I think that the concern you brought up is a big one.
I mean, I think his point is valid though, that I think that's probably going to be a fork of it, just because like how much
Yeah.
weight is around that project, how many people do it. They're not going to do it in the main line, to have a 2.0 support.
Right.
Somebody's going to fork it and that's what everyone's going to use, and eventually that'll be ported back in.
Yeah.
But
So anything else that we want to bring up before we wrap up our lengthy Angular 2? Well, great. Well, if anybody has actually watched the video this far through, I thank you for watching. And everybody here, I thank you for coming.